My son texted me late at night, and at first I didn't think much of it. Parents learn to live with that small jump in the chest whenever their phone lights up after midnight, especially when it's their child's name on the screen. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, sat down at the kitchen table, and opened the message expecting something ordinary. Maybe he needed advice, maybe he was stressed, maybe he just wanted to talk. Instead, I stared at a few short lines that felt colder the longer I read them. The words weren't cruel on the surface, but they were distant, clipped, almost rehearsed. He told me he needed space, that I shouldn't call for a while, that things were complicated, and it was better if I didn't get involved. I read it again, then a third time, my mind trying to fill in the gaps, searching for the son I had raised between those careful sentences. I typed a response, erased it, typed again, erased that too, and finally just put the phone face down on the table as if that could quiet the ache spreading through my chest. I wish I could say this came out of nowhere, but the truth is there had been signs long before that message arrived. Small changes at first. Shorter phone calls. Missed family dinners. Excuses that sounded reasonable enough that I didn't want to question them. I told myself this was just what happened when children grew into adults with busy lives. I told myself I was being sensitive. Mothers learn to do that too, to shrink their worries so they don't become a burden. Still, something about that text felt different. Final. As if a door had quietly closed while I wasn't looking. I thought back to the years when my son was younger, when he used to come into the kitchen while I was cooking just to tell me about his day, when he'd sit on the counter and swing his legs while I listened. I remembered late nights helping with school projects, the smell of glue and markers, the way he'd grin when something finally worked. I remembered how proud I was the first time he stood up for himself, how I believed I was raising a kind, thoughtful man. Those memories felt sharp now, like holding onto something fragile that was already cracking in my hands. After that text, days passed without another word. I respected his request, even though it felt like holding my breath underwater. I told myself giving him space was the loving thing to do. But silence has a way of growing louder with time. My thoughts filled the quiet. Had I done something wrong? Said something I shouldn't have? Was this about a conversation I couldn't even remember clearly anymore? I replayed years of moments in my head, searching for the mistake that might explain why my own child suddenly felt so far away. What hurt most wasn't just the distance but the tone of that message. It didn't sound like my son. It sounded careful, controlled, like words chosen to avoid argument rather than express feeling. I began to wonder who else might have helped him write it, or at least helped shape the feelings behind it. That thought made me uncomfortable, so I pushed it aside at first. It's easier to believe relationships drift naturally than to accept that someone might be quietly guiding that drift. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room with the television playing to no one, my phone buzzed again. For a moment, hope flared. Maybe this was him reaching out, reconsidering, explaining. Instead, it was another short message, even colder than the first. He repeated that he needed distance and added that I shouldn't make things harder by asking questions. That phrase settled heavily in my chest. Make things harder for whom? For him or for someone else entirely? That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not yet, but awareness. I realized I had been accepting confusion and pain without asking for clarity, simply because I didn't want to risk pushing him further away. I had been shrinking myself again. And while I still loved my son with every part of me, I knew deep down that love should not require silence or self-erasure. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just about space. There was something unspoken, something hidden beneath those carefully typed words. I didn't confront him. I didn't send a long emotional message or demand answers. Instead, I decided to pay attention, to listen not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. That text message was not the end of our story. It was the beginning of a truth I wasn't ready to see yet, but one that would slowly unfold piece by piece, whether I wanted it to or not. After those messages, I began to notice how much my life had quietly rearranged itself around his absence. I still woke up at the same time every morning, still made coffee the way I always had, but there was an emptiness to the routine now, as if something essential had been removed and everything else was pretending not to notice. I would reach for my phone out of habit, thinking of something small I wanted to share with him. A funny comment I'd heard, a memory sparked by a song on the radio, only to remember that I was not supposed to call. That simple instruction echoed in my mind more loudly than any argument ever could. Don't call. Don't ask. Don't make things harder. I told myself I was respecting his boundaries, but the truth was I was slowly learning how to disappear from his daily life, and that realization hurt more than I expected. The more I sat with the silence, the more I began to question how we had arrived here. I replayed recent visits in my mind, noticing details I had brushed off at the time. How he seemed distracted, how his answers felt filtered, as though he was checking them against someone else's expectations before speaking. There were moments when he looked at me with something like impatience, as if my presence itself required effort. At the time I blamed stress, work, adulthood. Now those memories rearranged themselves into a different picture, one that made my stomach tighten with unease. I thought about the people around him, the life he had built that no longer included me in any meaningful way. I wondered who he talked to when he needed advice now, who reassured him when things went wrong, who shaped his understanding of what was reasonable and what wasn't. A mother doesn't stop caring just because her child grows older. The worry simply changes shape. Mine had turned into a quiet fear that someone else's voice had become louder than mine, not because mine was wrong, but because it was inconvenient. One afternoon, I received a message from a relative asking if everything was okay between me and my son. The question caught me off guard. I typed a polite response, saying he was busy and doing well, then sat there staring at the screen long after the conversation ended. That's when it hit me that this distance wasn't invisible. Other people were noticing it too. And somehow, without anyone saying it outright, I felt as though I was being quietly repositioned, from mother to background figure, from someone central to someone optional. That night, sleep refused to come easily. My mind drifted back to earlier years, not out of nostalgia, but out of a need to remind myself of what had been real. I remembered standing beside him on his first day of school, the way he clutched my hand before finally letting go. I remembered arguments during his teenage years, the slammed doors, the apologies afterward. We had survived all of that together. We had talked through misunderstandings before. So why did this feel different? Why did it feel like I was being managed instead of heard? I began to realize that the pain wasn't only about missing him. It was about being denied the chance to understand him. Distance without explanation doesn't bring peace. It breeds self-doubt. I found myself questioning my own memories, my intentions, even my worth as a parent. And then quietly another thought emerged, one I had been avoiding. What if this wasn't entirely his decision? What if the words on my screen belonged to someone else's influence as much as they belonged to him? That possibility unsettled me deeply, not because I wanted someone to blame, but because it suggested something far more painful, that my son might be choosing comfort over honesty, ease over connection. I didn't want to believe that, yet the pattern was hard to ignore. His messages felt curated, emotionally distant in a way that didn't match the son I knew. They read like boundaries drafted by someone who saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a mother who loved him. Still, I stayed quiet. I answered politely when he did message, kept my words light, careful not to ask for more than he was willing to give. On the outside I was calm. On the inside something was slowly breaking open. I wasn't angry yet, but I was no longer unaware. The silence had done its job. It had forced me to listen closely. And what I was beginning to hear wasn't just distance. It was the sound of a relationship being rewritten without my consent. I didn't know then how far this would go, or how much it would cost me emotionally. All I knew was that this wasn't a phase that would resolve itself with time. Whatever was happening was deliberate, and sooner or later, I would have to decide whether to keep accepting the story being handed to me, or finally ask for the truth I had been quietly denied. By the time weeks had passed, the silence between us had begun to feel intentional rather than accidental, and that realization changed the way I carried myself through each day. I stopped waiting for my phone to buzz, not because I no longer cared, but because the waiting itself had started to feel humiliating, like standing outside a door that I was no longer welcome to knock on. Instead, I focused on keeping my life orderly, as if control over small things might balance the growing uncertainty inside me. I cleaned rooms that didn't need cleaning, reorganized drawers I rarely opened, and filled my days with errands just to avoid the quiet moments when my thoughts grew too loud. Yet no matter how busy I made myself, My mind kept circling back to the same question. How had love turned into something so fragile that it could be reduced to carefully spaced text messages? One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork, I came across a birthday card my son had written years ago. The handwriting was uneven, the spelling imperfect, but the message was unmistakably his, warm, open, full of affection. I sat there holding that card, feeling as though I was looking at proof of a version of our relationship that now felt unreal. It wasn't that I believed people never change. I knew they did. But this felt less like growth and more like erasure. As if the past itself was being quietly edited, rewritten to justify the distance of the present. That was when I noticed something else that had been happening alongside the silence. Decisions were being made without me. Family plans discussed elsewhere. Events I learned about after they had already happened. Conversations I wasn't part of but somehow still affected me. No one said outright that I was excluded, yet the pattern was clear. I was no longer consulted. I was informed sometimes, and sometimes not at all. It made me feel smaller in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, as if my place in my own family had subtly shifted to the margins. I tried to confront the idea that maybe this was just the natural progression of life, that parents eventually step back and let their children lead. But deep down I knew this wasn't that. Stepping back is different from being pushed aside. Love doesn't require permission to exist, and yet I was beginning to feel as though my presence itself needed approval. That realization hurt in a way I didn't know how to articulate to anyone else, so I carried it alone. Then came a moment that confirmed what I had been sensing all along. During a brief phone call, shorter than any we'd ever had, my son spoke in phrases that felt rehearsed, almost scripted. He emphasized how busy things were, how complicated life had become, how important it was to keep things calm. The words sounded reasonable, even mature, but they didn't sound like him. They sounded like compromise disguised as clarity. I listened quietly, responding only when necessary, and when the call ended, I sat there staring at the wall, my heart pounding with a mix of sadness and recognition. I finally allowed myself to admit what I had been avoiding. Someone else's comfort mattered more than my understanding. That realization didn't turn me angry. It made me thoughtful. I began to reflect on how often, throughout my life, I had chosen harmony over honesty, peace over confrontation. I had done it as a wife, as a mother, as a woman taught that love meant flexibility, patience, sacrifice. And now, here I was again being asked, without words, to shrink myself for the sake of someone else's ease. Only this time the cost felt heavier because it was coming from my own child. I started paying closer attention not just to what my son said, but to how I felt afterward. Drained, anxious, uncertain. Those feelings became my quiet guide. They told me something was wrong long before I was ready to say it out loud. I realized that maintaining this fragile connection required me to accept confusion as normal, to accept distance as deserved. And slowly, painfully, I understood that continuing this way would mean losing more than contact with my son. It would mean losing my sense of self. I didn't know yet how I would address this or what the outcome would be. I wasn't planning a confrontation or preparing a speech, but something inside me had shifted. I was no longer willing to be managed by silence. I was no longer willing to pretend that love meant disappearing quietly. Whatever came next, it would require courage I wasn't sure I had. But I knew I could no longer stay exactly where I was. As the days moved forward, I began to understand that awareness changes a person even before action does. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I noticed how carefully I chose my words whenever my son did reach out, how I softened my tone, avoided certain topics, and edited myself before speaking, all in the hope of preserving what little connection remained. It struck me how unnatural that felt. A mother shouldn't have to rehearse conversations with her own child. And yet here I was, treating every interaction like fragile glass, afraid that one wrong sentence might shatter it completely. That fear lived quietly in me, shaping my behavior in ways I didn't fully recognize until I stopped and asked myself when I had learned to be so careful with love. I started reflecting on my own past, not just as a mother, but as a woman. I realized how often I had been praised for being easygoing, for not making waves, for understanding everyone else's needs before my own. Those compliments had always sounded kind, but now they felt different, like they had trained me to accept less without complaint. Somewhere along the way, patience had been confused with silence, and sacrifice with invisibility. Seeing that pattern didn't make me bitter, but it did make me sad, especially knowing that it had followed me into my relationship with my son. One evening, while scrolling absent-mindedly through social media, I came across a photo he had posted. He looked happy, surrounded by people, smiling in a way that felt distant and unfamiliar. The caption was light, casual, full of warmth for everyone except the one person who was missing from the frame: me. I stared at that image longer than I should have, not out of jealousy but out of confusion. I was glad he was happy, truly, but I couldn't understand why that happiness seemed to require my absence, why closeness with others had been paired with distance from me. That night, I allowed myself to feel the grief I had been pushing away. Not just grief for the relationship as it was now, but for the expectations I had carried quietly for years. I had imagined growing older with a sense of mutual respect, of shared conversations, of being included even if I wasn't always central. I hadn't expected to be shut out so completely, or to feel as though my presence needed justification. Sitting alone in the dim light of my living room, I admitted something to myself that felt both painful and freeing. I missed my son, but I missed myself too. The next time he messaged, I noticed how quickly my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened, my breath caught, my hands trembled slightly as I read his words. There was nothing overtly unkind in the message, just a polite check-in, a few neutral updates. And yet, I felt drained afterward, as though I had given something without receiving anything back. That was when I realized that emotional distance can exist even in conversation. Words alone don't create connection. Intention does. I began to consider what it would mean to stop performing calmness and start honoring truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable. I wasn't looking to accuse or blame. I didn't want to force closeness or demand explanations that weren't freely given. But I also knew that continuing this way, accepting crumbs of communication while swallowing my hurt, was slowly eroding my sense of dignity. Love should not require self-abandonment, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. This wasn't about control or winning an argument. It was about clarity. I needed to know whether there was space for honesty between us, or whether silence had become the unspoken rule. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider that if the cost of staying connected was losing myself entirely, then distance chosen by me might be healthier than distance imposed on me. That thought scared me more than anything else so far. The idea of stepping back on my own terms felt risky, almost disloyal. Mothers are not taught how to let go in ways that protect them too. But deep inside, beneath the fear, there was a small sense of relief. Awareness had given me something I hadn't had before: choice. And I was beginning to understand that whatever happened next, it would shape not just my relationship with my son, but the way I valued myself moving forward. There came a moment when I realized that waiting for clarity from my son was keeping me emotionally suspended, unable to move forward, yet unable to return to what had been. That realization didn't arrive suddenly or dramatically. It crept in quietly, during an ordinary morning when I was standing at the sink, watching sunlight hit the counter, and felt an unexpected heaviness settle in my chest. I understood then that uncertainty had become my daily companion, shaping my mood, my thoughts, even my sense of purpose. I wasn't just missing my son, I was missing peace. And that absence was beginning to affect how I saw myself and my place in the world. I started to reflect on how easily I had accepted confusion as something I deserved. Whenever I felt hurt, I explained it away. Whenever I felt excluded, I told myself I was being dramatic. Over time, those explanations had piled up, forming a quiet narrative that said my feelings were secondary, negotiable, optional. Recognizing that pattern was uncomfortable, but it was also empowering. It made me see that the pain I was carrying wasn't proof of my weakness. It was proof that something important was being ignored. One afternoon, I decided to take a small step that felt much bigger than it was. I wrote my son a message, not long and not emotional, just honest. I told him I respected his need for space, but that the distance had been painful for me, and I wanted to understand what was happening between us. I read the message several times before sending it, resisting the urge to soften it or apologize for my feelings. When I finally pressed send, my heart raced, not because I expected a certain outcome, but because I was finally allowing myself to speak without editing my truth. The response didn't come right away. Hours passed, then a full day. I tried to stay busy, but my mind kept returning to that unanswered message. When his reply finally arrived, it was polite and controlled, acknowledging my feelings without really addressing them. He reassured me that he loved me, but insisted that things were complicated and that talking too much would only create tension. Reading those words, I felt a familiar sense of deflation. It wasn't rejection exactly. It was something quieter and more disorienting. It was being seen but not heard. That exchange clarified something I had been struggling to name. Love, when paired with avoidance, becomes confusing rather than comforting. And I was tired of confusion. I realized that I could continue reaching out, hoping for deeper connection, or I could accept what was being offered and decide how much of myself I was willing to give in return. That choice didn't feel empowering in the triumphant sense, but it did feel grounding. It allowed me to step out of the cycle of waiting and disappointment, even if only slightly. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding parts of my life that had quietly shrunk. I spent more time with friends, engaged in hobbies I had set aside, and allowed myself to enjoy moments without guilt. These changes didn't erase the pain, but they reminded me that my identity extended beyond one relationship, even one as deeply rooted as that between a mother and her son. I began to understand that nurturing myself wasn't a betrayal of him. It was an act of survival. Still, there were moments when grief returned unexpectedly. A song, a memory, a passing comment would catch me off guard, and I'd feel that familiar ache all over again. But now, instead of turning that pain inward, I let it exist without judgment. I allowed myself to miss him without questioning my worth. That shift, small as it was, made a difference. It gave my emotions room to breathe instead of trapping them in silence. I didn't know what the future of our relationship would look like. I still don't. But what I did know was that I could no longer sacrifice my emotional well-being in the hope of preserving something that wasn't meeting me halfway. Loving my son would always be part of who I am, but it didn't have to come at the cost of my own sense of self. And as I began to accept that truth, I felt a quiet strength returning, one that would carry me into whatever came next. As time moved forward, I noticed how silence changes its shape. In the beginning, it feels sharp and loud, filling every space with unanswered questions. Later, it becomes heavier, more settled, like furniture you never wanted but learned to walk around. That was the stage I found myself in now. My son and I were still in contact, but the connection felt cautious, measured, as if every word was being weighed before it was shared. I missed the ease we once had, the unfiltered conversations, the laughter that didn't require explanation. What hurt the most wasn't the distance itself, but the way it rewrote my memories. I found myself second-guessing moments I once held dear. Had I said something wrong back then? Had I missed signs of resentment? Or was this simply one of those painful transitions that parents aren't warned about, where love remains but access is quietly restricted? These questions lingered without answers, and I had to learn to live alongside them without letting them consume me. I began to realize that part of my pain came from expectations I never consciously set. I had assumed that effort would be met with effort, that honesty would invite honesty in return. When those expectations went unmet, it felt like a personal failure rather than a relational imbalance. Letting go of those assumptions was difficult but necessary. It meant accepting that my son's emotional capacity, at least for now, was different from what I hoped for. And that difference wasn't something I could fix. One evening, as I sat alone with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, I thought about how often parents are told to be patient, to be understanding, to be endlessly forgiving. Rarely are they told how to protect their own hearts in the process. I realized I had been practicing patience so intensely that I had neglected self-respect. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me thoughtful. It forced me to ask what healthy boundaries might look like in a relationship where love exists, but openness does not. Slowly, I started adjusting how much emotional energy I invested. I still replied when my son reached out. I still showed interest in his life. But I stopped chasing reassurance. I stopped rereading messages, searching for hidden meanings, hoping to find warmth where there was only neutrality. This wasn't an act of withdrawal. It was an act of balance. I was learning to meet him where he was without abandoning where I stood. There was a quiet sadness in accepting that some conversations might never happen. Apologies might never be spoken. Explanations might never be offered. But there was also relief in no longer waiting for those things to heal me. I understood that closure doesn't always come from others. Sometimes it comes from choosing to stop reopening the same wound in search of answers that may never arrive. As my days became fuller again, I noticed how resilience grows in small, unremarkable ways. I laughed more freely. I slept better. I felt present in moments that once passed me by unnoticed. And in those moments I discovered something unexpected. I wasn't becoming less of a mother by reclaiming my life. I was becoming a stronger one. Strong enough to love without control, and wise enough to step back when closeness wasn't welcomed. Despite everything, hope didn't disappear. It simply changed its form. It no longer demanded immediate resolution or emotional breakthroughs. Instead, it became a quiet belief that time, perspective, and growth could one day soften the space between us. I learned to hold that hope gently, without letting it dictate my happiness. Because I finally understood that my peace could not depend entirely on someone else's readiness to connect. And so I continued forward, not with certainty but with acceptance. Acceptance that relationships evolve. Acceptance that love can exist in imperfect forms. And acceptance that even in the absence of answers, I was allowed to choose peace. That choice, more than anything, marked the beginning of a new chapter. One where my story continued, whole and intact, regardless of how the next message might read. There are moments in life when you realize that healing is not a straight line but a quiet circle, returning you to places you thought you had already passed, only this time with softer eyes and steadier hands. That realization came to me one afternoon when my phone buzzed unexpectedly, and for a split second my heart reacted before my mind could catch up. It was my son. Nothing dramatic, no apology, no explanation. Just a simple message about something ordinary. And yet, it stirred something profound inside me. I noticed how differently I responded. There was no rush of anxiety, no desperate hope hidden between the lines. Instead, there was calm. I replied warmly, honestly, without stretching myself thin. That was when I understood how much I had changed. I began to see that distance had taught me things closeness never could. It taught me how to sit with uncertainty without letting it define my worth. It taught me that love does not require constant access to survive. Most importantly, it taught me that my role as a mother did not end where my son's emotional walls began. I could still care deeply while honoring the space he needed, even if I didn't fully understand it. That balance, once impossible, now felt like a quiet strength. Looking back, I realized how often I had measured my success as a parent by my child's closeness to me. When that closeness faded, it felt like failure. But with time, I saw how flawed that measurement was. Children grow into their own worlds, carrying experiences we may never fully see. Their distance is not always rejection. Sometimes it is simply their way of surviving, learning, becoming. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it gave it context. And context softened its edges. I stopped replaying old conversations in my mind, stopped rewriting the past in search of a version where I said everything perfectly. I accepted that I had done the best I could with the knowledge and tools I had at the time. That acceptance brought a kind of peace that no apology ever could. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't holding my breath for emotional permission to move forward. I was already moving. What surprised me most was how this shift affected other parts of my life. I became more patient, not just with others but with myself. I noticed beauty again in small, ordinary moments, the warmth of sunlight through a window, the comfort of familiar routines, the quiet satisfaction of a day lived gently. These moments didn't replace my longing, but they reminded me that life was still rich, still meaningful, still mine. There were still days when sadness crept in uninvited, when I wondered what my son remembered about his childhood, and whether he saw me with the same tenderness I still felt for him. But those thoughts no longer ruled me. I learned to let them pass, like clouds that don't require a storm to exist. I reminded myself that relationships are living things, changing shape over time, influenced by growth, wounds, and circumstances far beyond any single conversation. I also began to understand that reconciliation, if it ever came, would not look like a dramatic moment of tears and confessions. It would come quietly, slowly, through consistency and mutual readiness. And if it didn't come at all, that too would be something I could survive. This realization didn't harden my heart. It freed it. I was no longer living in anticipation of something that might never happen. I was living now. In choosing peace, I didn't choose distance. I chose dignity. I chose to honor my love without sacrificing myself to it. I chose to remain open but not exposed. And in doing so, I reclaimed parts of myself I didn't realize I had lost along the way. I was still a mother, always would be. But I was also a whole person deserving of calm, joy, and emotional safety. As I placed my phone down that day, I felt something settle within me. Not closure but clarity. Whatever the future held between my son and me, I knew one thing for certain. I would meet it with grace, honesty, and self-respect. And that, in its own quiet way, felt like healing. The truth is, life rarely gives us the endings we imagine when we are in the middle of pain. There is no final scene where everything is explained. No perfect conversation where every wound is acknowledged and healed. What life offers instead is something quieter and, in many ways, braver, the chance to keep going without all the answers. I learned that slowly in the days that followed, as my world continued in its gentle rhythm. I cooked meals for myself without rushing. I watered the plants I had neglected when grief felt heavier than routine, and I allowed silence to exist without filling it with worry. My son remained part of my life, but not the center of it anymore. And that shift did not diminish my love. It steadied it. I stopped seeing our relationship as something broken that needed fixing and began seeing it as something evolving, even if that evolution was painful. Some connections change shape over time not because they fail, but because the people inside them grow differently. Accepting this didn't mean giving up hope. It meant releasing control. I could love him without chasing him, care without collapsing into guilt, remember without reliving. That balance, once unthinkable, became my quiet triumph. There were moments when I imagined the future. Holidays that might include him again. Conversations that might finally come with honesty and warmth. I didn't cling to those images, but I didn't banish them either. They existed as gentle possibilities, not expectations. And for the first time, that felt healthy. I had learned that hope works best when it is held loosely. I also began to understand something deeper about myself. For years, I had defined my worth by how needed I was. As a mother, as a wife, as the emotional anchor of a family. When that need faded, I felt invisible. But in the stillness that followed, I found something unexpected, my own presence. I discovered that I mattered even when no one was leaning on me. That my life had value simply because I was living it with intention and honesty. That realization changed everything. I no longer measured my days by messages received or missed. I measured them by how peacefully I moved through them, by whether I spoke kindly to myself, by whether I allowed joy to enter without guilt. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, joy did return. Not loud or dramatic, but steady. The kind that settles into your bones and reminds you that survival can be soft. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with golden light, I thought about the woman I had been at the beginning of this story, waiting, hoping, breaking quietly. I felt tenderness for her. She did the best she could. She loved deeply even when it hurt. And now, standing where I was, I felt gratitude for the strength that pain had carved into me. I hadn't lost myself after all. I had found myself. If my son ever reads this story, I hope he understands that love does not disappear just because silence exists. It waits. It adapts. It learns when to speak and when to step back. And if he never does, that is okay too. This story is not about blame or victory. It is about becoming whole again after feeling fractured. So this is where my story rests, not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet beginning. I wake up each day grounded in who I am, open to connection but no longer dependent on it for my sense of worth. I carry love without carrying pain, memory without bitterness, hope without desperation. And that, I've learned, is its own kind of peace.